Good afternoon and welcome to the third in a series of 4 webinars about the impact of climate change on the Great Ocean Road and its coastal erosion. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of this massive stretch of coast, the Wathaurong, the Gadibanod, the Girrawurrung and the Gurritjamara people. We acknowledge that this is unceded land and we would like to pay our respects to their elders past, present and emerging. My name is Gail Jennings and I'm your host for this webinar. I'm a scientist and a former ABC broadcaster, and I've been part of the Aries Inlet community for about 40 years. This series of 4 webinars has been brought to you by the Great Ocean Road Communities Network. The first webinar on Monday looked at erosion on at Anglesea, Wye River and Apollo Bay as case studies, and you will have seen it was very prescient since the Demon's Bluff at Anglesea collapsed this afternoon or today. The second webinar on Tuesday presented the science behind current and emerging physical impacts of climate change, particularly on coastal erosion. And today we're focusing on the next step, what to do about the pressures and impacts of climate change and the concomitant coastal erosion, including for whom would we do these things, how do we mitigate, avoid or somehow adapt to it, and who pays and how we make them. That's just some of the issues. Our 3 speakers, Professor Lauren Rickards, Dr. Sonia Graham and Dr. Meredith Gibbs, will discuss these social, legal and regulatory issues as a consequence of these huge pressures on our Great Ocean Road. Now, I'm going to ask them to just introduce themselves at the start of their 15-minute talk. So we'll go straight through those 3 15-minute talks. And then at the end, there'll be questions. If you've got questions to ask, you can just put them into the little chat function down the, or the Q&A function and type it in there. And we'll get to those later. And please do remember that this session is being recorded. So we'll start now with Lauren. Over to you, Lauren.
Thank you so much, Gail, and thank you for the opportunity to be here. I'd like to acknowledge that I'm coming from the unceded lands of the Boiwurrung and Wurrung language groups of the Eastern Kulin Nations and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. So as Gail said, my name is Lauren Rickards. I'm a professor at RMIT University, where I lead a climate change transformations research program. And I also am now leading a climate change living lab and the Urban Futures platform. I'm also lucky to be a lead author with the forthcoming Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report on impacts, adaptation and vulnerability, part of the team writing the chapter on Australasia. So as Gail said, as Peter said earlier, so Demon's Bluff is gone, and that just indicates the timeliness of what we're talking about here. What I want to do is step back and just provide some, I guess, basic conceptual ideas for us to think about as we think about this topic of how we adapt to the existing and forthcoming impacts of climate change. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what adaptation is, what it involves, and what we need to do. I'm trying to keep it fairly focused, so there's obviously going to be a lot of details I don't cover, so do feel free to jump in with questions. So what is it when we're talking about adaptation? Well, adaptation has many, many meanings, but here's a sort of basic one for us to play with. First of all, simply the idea of fitting, better fitting. As organisms, as humans, we've always had to change and adapt to a changing environment. We now have to do that at double time, and we also have to do it to things that haven't even yet emerged, but which we know are coming. And so what this means is that we're changing in a way that allows some aspect of something that we value to be better fitted to the climate change realities, both present and future. And we need to do that not only to reduce impacts, but because such change creates a huge opportunity to create new benefits as well. One of the things to keep in mind that of course this is not happening in a vacuum. It's a whole lot of intersecting processes, and as I'll discuss, just getting to grips with those intersecting processes, including how other people are going about adapting, acknowledged or not, is very, very important. It's difficult and contested. It is hard work. It requires hard conversations. And the fact that everybody on this call is even here, dedicating time, thought and energy to it already, indicates the work involved, but also indicates that the pillars are being put in place already. It's necessary, but as I said, it's really vital to keep in mind that this is not just a sort of compliance type thing. This potentially is an opportunity for us to create a whole lot of positive benefits, including addressing problems that we've been meaning to and should have addressed a long time ago, because let's not pretend that everything today is perfect. One of the things that we need to do in thinking about adaptation is also accept that the future is now clouded with a great deal of uncertainty. So whereas previously we used to think that we could sort of forecast things with a fair degree of accuracy and precision, now we're moving out to thinking in terms of probabilities, but we're also moving out to consider even possibilities. And the whole COVID-19 pandemic and its really unimagined effects indicate the need to think at the real edges of that scenario cone that someone has usefully graffitied on the wall there. But importantly, we also need to remember that we have a choice and that we can make really active, positive choices and think about what's preferable. Where do we actually want to go? When we think about impacts, sometimes people discuss them in a way as if they somehow fall from the sky or they wash up from the beach. And definitely there are climatic and physical elements that obviously are changing that are part of this. But the impact is very much the intersection between those changes and their flow-on effects and what is already a dynamic context. And what that means is that impacts are highly socially uneven and that there's also a great deal of opportunity for us to change things. We can change both aspects of the blue, climatic and physical variability, beginning, of course, with actually reducing the degree to which the climate is changing. And we can change many, many aspects of that orange existing dynamic context, make it softer, make it better able to accommodate the changes so that the impacts are not as sharp. So I want to focus my talk on this simple diagram, which indicates that we're talking about an intersection of 4 different aspects. So if we think of risks, if we break it down a little bit more, risks are potential impacts, and those potential impacts, if we break down what I showed as the sort of the orange existing context, what we're talking about is aspects of exposure, so the spatial questions, and that also has a temporal aspect, aspects of existing vulnerability, or flip that, we can think of existing adaptive capacity, and aspects of what others are doing and responding. And then we put in place that as well and consider the hazard, which is those climatic and physical and biophysical flow-on effects. All 4 of those aspects are shaped by social drivers. And what that means is that all of them can be reduced. Depending on how optimistic you are about society, that degree of reduction looks greater or lesser. But the fact is that there are things that we are doing which are either making risks worse, and likewise there are things we can do that can make those risks a lot less, and in fact even create positive co-benefits. So I want to move through these and look at these in turn. So the hazards. So we think about hazards such as coastal erosion, clearly the core topic of this. I wanted to get that front and centre. So yes, coastal erosion is caused by changes in the ocean conditions, the level of the seas, all the things that Kathleen McKines and others have talked to you about in previous webinars. But at the same time, we also create conditions that are conducive or not to erosion, including things like destabilising the soil. And of course, destabilising the soil is caused by things such as clearing vegetation. And so what that means is if we actually do put in place actions to actually protect existing vegetation, reduce soil instability, then straight away we're reducing the risk of coastal erosion. And of course, we may be generating important co-benefits for biodiversity and amenity as well. Other threats also have a very strong social fingerprint and again point to options for adaptation. So let's think about drought. Drought's definitely one where people have a sense that, you know, droughts do sort of emerge just with the climate. But of course, as soon as you think about it for a moment, you realise that actually a drought of water demand. And so we have that lever of demand that we can use. And that exists too along the coastal area, around the Great Ocean Road. And this is, you know, just one indication of water demand. These are groundwater licenses. And it just indicates that, you know, there's a whole range of different ways in which we can think about reducing how much water we're extracting, reducing how much water we're using, so that if our freshwater reserves are impacted by, for example, saline intrusion, that impact is not as great because we're not so dependent. Okay, let's move on to the question of exposure. Clearly, this one has a very strong social fingerprint. So where have we placed things to date? Where have we placed things to date that we value, that we love? Some of these things are not movable. We might be thinking particularly around beaches and loved physical environments. And I should say the Great Ocean Road has been part of my life since I was a baby. So I'm very much part of loving and valuing these environments. But when it comes to adaptation, we do need to think about the where the location of things. So what that means is that we can think about what we might want to do to protect them. And this is clearly already very much part of the conversation around coastal erosion, Great Ocean Road and other coastal communities. There's a range of mechanical processes, some involving more concrete than others. But, you know, there's a range of different options that may or may not suit particular contexts and may or may not be effective. There's also unintended benefit consequences sometimes, and also they don't work for very long. So then we get to the more what's often called transformational or full less incremental approaches to adaptation, such as relocating either temporarily or permanently. And what that means is that we need to start thinking, first of all, about where we're putting new things and make sure we're not creating new exposures, but also about where we might relocate, how we might relocate. And that's where, as painful as that is, and depending on how it's done, there can be benefits, opportunities to perhaps build things better in other places. Turning now to the question of existing vulnerabilities, or even more positively, adaptive capacity. So this is the question of, well, what else is going on? You know, how good or bad are other things, all I think other things sort of considered. And that's not just for us as individuals or households, but of course for us as communities, and, you know, as a state, as a nation, as a globe. And not just now, but later. So clearly, as my students complain, this means you have to understand the whole world. And I'm like, yes, sorry. Unfortunately, it does quickly tip into high degrees of complexity. But at the same time, it's also really basic, because we're talking about addressing really basic known disadvantage. So take, for example, poverty. There's a map there, in case you can't read the text. It's spatial distribution of poverty rates across Victorian local government areas, and it's notable that one of the higher rates is down around the Apollo Bay area there, for example. There's many others across Victoria as well, but it's just an indication of the way in which we already have disadvantage. We know that's there, we know we need to address it, and we know that addressing it will reduce the impacts of climate change as well. At the same time, we also know we have issues such as not just poorly located houses, but people who don't actually have access to any house. And so homelessness, for example, in the Great South Coast area further west has increased dramatically between 2011 and 2016. So once again, you've got adaptation options. It's about getting your house in order. Let's sort out these problems, because the longer these problems, and it's not just socioeconomics, it's also to do with social cohesion, it's also to do with how well our institutions function, how well we look after all of our environmental and ecological systems as well. All these things we know we need to do to thrive today, and we certainly need to do them in order to be able to survive tomorrow. And just to give you a little bit of an example of this, this gives us an opportunity to think about enabling the enablers. So what are all the systems and structures that help us? So for one, community service organisations. We know in rural communities, there's a huge reliance on volunteers, a huge reliance on not-for-profit organisations. Well, how are they resourced? How well are they coping? What can we do to adapt them so that they may help others adapt as well? And I know the Jesuit Social Services, for example, are doing a huge amount on climate change, particularly because they realised just how influential their own adaptation is. And just not to kind of get too technical here, but it does get us into big questions about what sort of community we want, how we think, what sort of underlying systemic structures do we want to have in place, and even things such as mental models. So all of this can be part of the adaptation story when we think about that question of how can we actually get our systems thriving as well as possible today. So finally, the question of responses. What are others doing? And how are they doing it? Why are they doing it? So this is a really, really important complexity to climate change adaptation, which is really only starting to get understood. Really what we need to be considering this is that there's a whole pathway. There's a whole lot of interactions. One of the things this really emphasises is the need to really focus on how decision-making is being made, including which voices are being heard, which skills and knowledges are being brought to the fore, how imaginative are those decisions and actions? Are they actually stretching into the scenario cone of preferable futures? So this is where participatory decision-making and collective sense-making, which is a fancy word for what we're doing right now here in this webinar, is all about. It's about actually coming together to say, well, none of us know, none of us have the answer, so we need to communicate and work together. We obviously need to work across sectors, have place-based approaches. We need to manage uncertainty, acknowledge the need to address scenarios. And we also need to monitor and evaluate outcomes to make sure that what's emerging is not negative, and that we're also harnessing positive consequences that might be emerging as well. And there's some real lessons for why we need to do this. Adaptation also can veer into what's called maladaptation, which is where not only does it not work, but it can actually create new problems and make things worse for others. In the US, coastal adaptation, including relocation, is known to be causing what's called climate gentrification. So it's basically squeezing the prices and the properties further away from the coast. At the same time, those who can't relocate are being left. We need to make sure those patterns are not being repeated here. We also need to make sure that there's all sorts of other environmental effects that are being considered as well, so that adaptation is not creating more problems than it's fixing. So in conclusion, just want the take-home message is that climate change impacts don't fall from the sky, nor do they wash up on the beach from the sea. They're very much co-generated by many other factors. And what that means is that we can address those other factors as levers for adaptation. All of them allow us to reduce the risks involved, but they also create opportunities to create positive outcomes. Those outcomes are highly uncertain, and so we need to use our hive mind to work together and to do it more carefully and purposefully than ever. Okay, thanks. I'll leave it there.
Thank you very much, Lauren. That was just absolutely fabulous. And we'll have questions later on for you. Thank you. Such an interesting and very relevant overview. And we'll go now to Dr. Sonia Graham.
Hi, everyone. My name's Dr. Sonia Graham. I'm a researcher at the University of Wollongong. And today I'd just like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land from which I'm zooming in on today, which is the Bidjigal land of the Eora Nation. I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands where the research was done and that I'll be talking about today, and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. So for almost 10 years now, I've been doing research that's looking at the social impacts of adaptation to sea level rise. And this began with research that I was doing at the University of Melbourne. And since then, I've taken the approach we developed there and applied it in a range of other places as well. So I'm going to be talking not only about the research I've done previously in Victoria, in East Gippsland, but also the work that I've done since then. So when we talk about the impacts of climate change, what often happens is we start to talk about numbers. We talk about the extent to which sea levels are going to rise in the future, the frequency with which storm surges are likely, as we heard about on Monday and Tuesday. We talk about the kilometres of coastline that are going to be affected and the speed at which that change is occurring. We talk about the number of people who are going to experience flooding. We talk about the amount of infrastructure, the length of roads impacted, the dollars it will cost to replace or move roads, surf life-saving buildings, cycling tracks, toilets, car parks, all of this coastal infrastructure that we have. But the issue is if we focus on the numbers and the things, we lose the focus on the people. And so the research that we've been doing is about putting the emphasis on people and the things that matter to them, and the things, the relationships, but what we might consider things that aren't quite so tangible or easy to measure. So we want to know what is important to people so that we know what to prioritise. As in Lauren's words before, what's preferable, so that we know what decisions to make about what we want to do, how to do it and when. So the research I do asks questions about the lives of people who live and visit the coast. What do they care about the most? How will people who live in these places and visit these places be affected not only by the processes of environmental change, but also by the policies that we create? How can we plan for the future if we don't have a good understanding of what people value, want to protect and prioritise? And so the research that we've been doing has developed a method for trying to understand, identify and incorporate those things into adaptation planning. So we refer to this as a values-based approach to adaptation. So it's very much about putting the things that matter most to people at the very heart of adaptation. It's about setting local goals that are about what each community needs. And in doing so, what we're hoping is that we make adaptation more equitable, more inclusive and legitimate. So one of the key concepts that we have at the heart of this is an idea called lived values. So these are the valuations that we make as individuals or with our families, our communities, about what is important in our lives and the places in which we live and visit. So we often articulate these very explicitly, and we heard on Monday about lots of things that people value and love about Wye River and Anglesey and other places along the Great Ocean Road. But there's also ways people express this through the places in which they visit. And so when we apply this approach, we talk to people, we do interviews, we do surveys, but we also go into communities and do observations and see where people are and what they're doing. We ask people about what they like, about where they live and visit, what frustrates them, what activities they participate in, and who they engage with. So as I mentioned, we started this research in 2012 over in East Gippsland, and since then we've done this research with other people in Tasmania, in New South Wales, and most recently in Spain. It's not just us who's been doing this research. There are also other places that have taken up the method we developed and are using it elsewhere. So I just put up this report because the Townsville City Council saw our approach and employed some consultants to apply it. So today I'm going to talk about the work that I've been involved in and talk about what we've been learning over the last 10 years. So when we ask people about what they love about the coast, we get a lot of really consistent responses. So I'm putting up a table here, and what you'll see on the left-hand side are a range of things that we asked that people mentioned that they value the most, and then each of the communities that I've worked with. So I've just listed there the first 4 things that people said that they valued the most about where they live. And what I've put in bold are the things that are pretty consistent across communities. So we see that obviously, as you'd expect in coastal settings, the natural environment is very important, the relaxed coastal lifestyle and the peace and quiet, as well as being close to water or the beach. And so those are things that are not only highly important within communities, and we find that these top 4 things are usually valued by 80–90% of the people that we talk to in each of these communities, which is an astounding level of agreement as far as social scientists are concerned. But there are also things that are consistent across communities. And that's great. It's really important that we know what we agree on and what we really value and want to protect. But as Lauren was alluding to before, adaptation involves hard decisions. And one of the reasons that it's so hard is because there are a lot of things that we don't agree on or that people have different views and preferences for. And so we've also tried to unpack what it is that people love about the coast, but is different both within and across communities. So for a range of the communities we've worked in, we've identified that there are particular types of lifestyles that exist in coastal communities. And when we're planning for adaptation, we need to take these different lifestyles into account, because adaptation policies will affect people differently depending on the way they live and work and visit the coast. When we look across the studies, we find a number of similarities in things that we need to consider about the communities who live in these places. So partly it might be about those elements of vulnerability that Lauren talked about before. So considering levels of poverty, the extent to which people need assistance. But we've also found it's really important to consider the extent to which people may be working or retired, their levels of social activity, whether they're involved in community organisations, whether they're business owners, the length of their connection to the place. So some of the communities we've talked to, their families have been going to a particular place for 100 years. And this has an impact on the way they see these communities and what they want to protect. There are differences between primary and secondary homeowners, between residents and visitors, between those people who are homebodies and like to just stay around the home and those who like to spread out and explore their environment around them. There are those who tend to preference visiting many coastal locations and those who prefer the bush. And when we start to understand the different types of people who live in the communities, then we come up with ways of developing adaptation plans for each place that helps them address and maintain those things that they really care about. But also we get ideas into what frustrates them. And if we know what frustrates them, then when we're planning adaptation policies, we can begin to incorporate those things into our plan. So for some people we talked to in Lakes Entrance, they were really frustrated by the lack of opportunities for youth in the town, the lack of entertainment options. And so for these communities, when planning for adaptation and making plans for those communities, those are some of the things that we might take into account. So analysing common interests helps us to develop engagement strategies. So some of those people who are really heavily connected to their communities and are members of multiple community groups may be engaged differently to those who aren't. It helps to identify who's going to benefit and who's going to lose out from our proposed adaptation responses. And it helps us to develop not just one single adaptation strategy for places, but a suite of packages that helps to take into the diversity of communities into account. So one of the other things that we've discovered in doing this research is that a lot of adaptation planning is based on the long-term residents of a particular place. And partly that's because they're the ones in a sense that are easiest to engage. They're there, they're always in these communities. But our research has shown it's also important to consider visitors to locations and the other places that people visit. And so I'm just going to show a map, and it might be slightly confusing, but I'm just trying to communicate a message about the way in which people use the coast. And again, there's different lifestyles and ways in which people engage the coast. So this map here shows the East Gippsland Shire Council, and it's got 4 different people represented on this map. So the solid line might be the easiest to follow. So that's one person who lives in Lakes Entrance and who might be considered someone who just loves lots of coastal locations. So when they go away for weekends, when they recreate, they frequently visit lots of places on the coast. And so we might consider the way in which people are not only vulnerable because of where they live and whether their homes are going to be affected or the key infrastructure, their working places are going to be affected, but also the other places that they may recreate. You can see there some of the other people were less likely to go on the coast and may be affected by other climatic impacts associated with climate change, like bushfires. And so this is just, I guess, thinking about planning for adaptation. It's about taking multiple people and ways of interacting with the coast into account. Not only that, it's also about taking a bigger picture perspective. And so as researchers, we tend to focus on individual climate change impacts like sea level rise. But there's more and more imperative to consider other impacts. And so we know, for example, that Malakuta that you can see there on the map was heavily affected by the Black Saturday bushfires. So one of the other key parts of the research we did in the University of Melbourne was to think about how do we do this over time? And I think this became really salient in that presentation by Juliet on Monday about Wye River, when a body of evidence was being developed by the community about how the beach and that part of the coast was changing, and there was photographic evidence developed. And one of the challenges there was in not only putting together a plan, but making sure that that happened at the critical point in time, where they had to confront change all of a sudden. And what we found in some communities is that not everyone is on board or agrees that some of these impacts are happening or are going to happen in the future. So the question becomes, how do we plan for impacts that are going to evolve over the long term and bring the community along with us? So we came up with the idea of an adaptation pathway. So this is about taking slow, measured steps over time and having a plan at each point in time for what comes next. So again, another graph that I know can be a little bit overwhelming, but basically the idea is we have the here and now, and you might consider that to be step one. And we have the plans, for example, we have coastal zone management plans for how we want to manage the coast now. And we have to think about the future. Okay, so now that we know what different people in the community want, how do we develop a plan that meets those diverse needs? And at what point will we introduce that plan? So it might be when a key piece of infrastructure becomes threatened, such as the access to a surf club. And once that point is reached, that next plan is not only there, but is ready to be implemented. Obviously, we need to be reflexive and decide whether the plan that as it evolves is still meeting our needs. So an adaptation pathway is essentially a decision strategy that stages adaptation over a sequence of manageable steps over time, each of which is triggered by a change in environmental or social conditions. So it indicates when adaptation actions might no longer be effective and when we're going to need to bring new ones in. These things aren't necessarily predetermined, but require us to reflect and monitor conditions over time. We expect that such an approach allows us the time and space for building collective local action. It needs to be flexible in light of new information and helps us to distribute responsibility for decision-making across the generations. It also, we anticipate, would help overcome opposition, as some of the more costly actions can be avoided until more evidence becomes available. And it helps us to have a no regrets actions to start in the short term and gives people time and choices about how to adapt. So overall, these are the key things that we've learned from the research that we've been doing on social impacts to adaptation and a lived values approach. So for adaptation to be equitable, we need to understand and accommodate diverse needs in the community. We also need a plan for each community along the coast. And I know this might sound overwhelming, but from the research we've done, having one single plan, for example, for a local government area is too high a scale for really developing plans that meet the needs of communities, as well as recognising that each particular part of the coast has its own set of environmental dynamics that need to be taken into account. And I think this was really evident from the presentations on Monday and Tuesday, that each of those case studies had very different issues that they were facing. And finally, that adaptation plans need to take into account multiple climate change impacts. So we've got to take that bigger perspective and consider the other impacts associated with climate change, not just single issues. And so we did develop a guide for government. So if other people wish to follow the sort of approach that we did, it's stepped out, it's got examples of the surveys and the interviews that we used. And obviously, if anyone wants further information from me, they can reach out. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Sonia. That was absolutely fabulous. Thank you. And we'll have questions for you with everyone else at the end. Thank you. And now I'd like to ask Meredith Gibbs if you'd like to speak. Thank you, Meredith.
Thank you, Gail. I'll just share my screen. Perfect. Thank you. Well, hello, everyone, and thank you to the previous presenters. They were great presentations. My presentation will be a little bit of a change of pace. I'll be looking at some of the particular legal issues associated with coastal climate change risks. So I'm Dr. Meredith Gibbs, and I'm principal of Gibbs Advisory, which is a boutique law firm specialising in environmental, water and climate change law. I've been working in this field for over 25 years and have been recognised in Australia's Best Lawyers for my expertise in climate change law for over a decade. I also wish to pay my respects to the traditional owners of the land on which I'm zooming from, which is the Wiradjuri of the Kulin Nation, and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. Before I start this presentation, I am going to do the lawyerly thing and put in a disclaimer, just really to say that this is not a comprehensive presentation about all of the legal issues that could arise. In 15 minutes, I'll need to keep pretty much to my script, which is going to focus on land use planning issues. And so with that, I'll be looking at particularly about decision making in that context and some recent case law and the relevance for coastal erosion. Before I get onto that, I wanted to make some comments about the challenge of regulating for climate change and any environmental regulation, and that's managing the tension between the need and desire for the law to be certain and consistent, for example, across Victoria or even nationally, and the need for flexibility and for the law to be able to adapt to particular circumstances and changing situations. And this tension is particularly evident when regulating coastal climate change risks, because we're regulating for the impacts of a dynamic coastal system with a changing climate and an ever-increasing body of knowledge, and the need to keep updating that knowledge as we learn more about the climate and the climate change impacts. The public and regulatory bodies need to know what they can and can't do with certainty, how people can comply, but there'll be site-specific situations and, as I've mentioned, change over time that require flexibility. So the law is operating and being updated and reinterpreted in this context in the face of considerable uncertainty. And we often see calls for either certainty or flexibility at different times by different players, and sometimes for both by the same player, depending on the situation. With another challenge for regulating coastal climate change risks is that we're operating at the intersection of traditionally separate legal frameworks. And because coastal climate change risk management incorporates coastal management, flood risk management, and land use planning, and each of those is dealt with under a different legislative framework, there's no single minister or agency responsible for climate change risk management. And there's a potential for overlaps and confusion between roles. And that was evident in some of the case studies earlier in presentations where there was confusion about roles. And this is one of the reasons why. Added to that, governments have had a tendency to redistribute roles and responsibilities between departments, chopping and changing departments and changing their names, so we never quite know what they're called at different times. And this comment that I have on the screen here is from a report that I co-authored in 2011, but it holds true today, that it's really this overlap and that's what leads to some of the confusion about roles and responsibilities. Much of the early litigation in coastal climate change focused on the ability, or indeed the requirement, for decision makers to take into account climate change in land use planning under the Planning and Environment Act. And as climate change emerged as an issue, we saw a reinterpretation of existing provisions in the Planning and Environment Act to clarify that local councils and other decision makers could, and indeed in certain circumstances must, consider climate change issues in their planning schemes and amendments to planning schemes and permit decisions, including conditions on permits. And so in the last decade, we've seen a raft of climate change provisions being introduced into planning schemes. And so that's a big shift from where we were, say, 10 years ago, where there were very few provisions specifically on coastal climate change in our planning schemes. So I just wanted to take you to some quick examples from the Surf Coast planning scheme. You can see here that coastal climate change risks are now specifically identified in the planning scheme, and direction given as to where development should take place and not take place, depending on the risk. So risk-based planning. here specifically in relation to coastal inundation and erosion. Of course, there were always provisions in planning schemes about coastal issues, coastal hazards, but now we see that the addition of a specific provision for climate change. Early on, there was also a lot of focus on getting sea level rise benchmarks into general coastal policies and then into planning schemes. And so that has now been achieved. And you can see here on the slide that one of the strategies is to plan for sea level rise of not less than 0.8 metres by 2100. And this is a good example of that tension that I was talking about between certainty and flexibility. So there were calls for sea level rise benchmarks to be consistent across Victoria and indeed Australia. But we heard on Tuesday, I think it was, that in fact there are great variations in the level of sea level rise in different locations under different scenarios that we could expect. So, you know, what's the appropriate benchmark? What do we write into our planning schemes? Should it be the same everywhere? Should it be site specific? So in terms of the actual wording, I'm going to go to a snip from the planning scheme itself, and you'll see here that we're talking about not less than, so you could plan for more if that was what the situation demanded, and a direction to look at combined effects of these relevant matters here and when assessing those risks and coastal impacts. You see also there that there is direction around things like avoiding use and development in areas that are vulnerable to coastal inundation. So we don't want to put more development in vulnerable areas, and we want to respond to different coastal types. And here you also see a hierarchy, if you like, directing how adaptation should be looked at. And I'll come back to retreat and protect shortly. And just right down on the bottom of the screen, I hope you can see that ensure that development or protective works that seek to respond to coastal hazard risks avoid detrimental impacts on coastal processes. And we've heard a bit about that in previous sessions where particularly hard coastal works might fix a problem in one situation only to find you've got a problem down the coast somewhere. Or, as mentioned earlier, that the solution may only be for a short period of time. And this is the rest of the particular policy, which is just picking up a whole range of policy documents, making it really clear that the decision maker is required to take all of these into account. So that's really just an example of some of the policy directives we've seen introduced to planning schemes. But the more direct controls, if you like, come through zones and overlays and schedules there too. And that's where you find the permit triggers. So the need to obtain a permit for a development, for example, and then controls through permit conditions. And some of the obvious overlays that could be used. But there are some issues and limitations with this in terms of coastal climate change risk management and adaptation issues. So as you'll see from this slide, there's quite a bit to unpack, and I won't have time to do all of that today, but just to, I guess, look at a couple of those issues. So when considering how to address, so what I was talking about previously in terms of needing to have a permit, that's really about new development. What are we doing about existing settlements? How do we deal with coastal climate change risks and impacts? So one of the issues around this idea of rezoning, you might think, well, we'll put in a more restrictive zone to limit development in vulnerable areas or apply overlays, is that first of all, you're going to need really robust information, because as soon as you put a restrictive zone into a plan, there's going to be all sorts of issues around reduction of property values, but because of the reduced development potential for that land. So that's one sort of social issue that we need to be aware of. Also, legally, that will be ineffective against what we call existing use rights. So that is I guess a planning concept which refers to the fact that if you've been undertaking an existing use for 15 years without any large discontinuation or suspension of the use, you've got the right to continue that. And equally, if you've legally developed a property in accordance with a permit, then you're able to carry on that use for the period for which the permit applies. So just the simple rezoning won't assist you with a lot of development and infrastructure that's already in place. So that really has implications for how you're going to implement a policy of managed retreat, and really starts to hit up against our notions of private property and what we should be allowed to do on our property, and ideas of the castle and so forth, should be springing to your mind there. So they're just some things about, even though we might have some great tools to reduce intensity of existing settlements, there are going to be barriers and limitations. So we need to start thinking about novel or sort of new approaches. And I wanted to just draw on a couple of examples in the time available, both nationally and internationally, where people are trying to think a little bit outside the box. So just a couple here. The first, they're time-limited rights. This refers to the concept then, rather than a property right being in perpetuity, one that can be bought and sold and inherited, if you like, a more limited concept of property rights might be appropriate in these coastal vulnerable areas. And so the right might only be available for a set period of time, which could be set, for example, on estimates of when sea level rise will reach a certain point, or coastal erosion patterns, and so forth. So it's a more limited concept of property. The next one, rolling easements, is really interesting and has been implemented in the States in certain places. And that's the idea where you get a right to occupy land that moves, if you like, as the coast moves. So as the coast moves back, your property right moves back with it. Of course, that's only going to work if there's nothing behind it, or perhaps some crown land or a nature area that you can move back into. Obviously, it's not going to work if you've got private property rights behind, but it's sort of an interesting type concept to start to look at. And then particularly up in areas like Byron Bay, we've seen planning requirements where you can only develop on land subject to coastal erosion where you are able to rapidly dismantle the property, the house rather, or move it back. I think you've got to be able to dismantle it or move it within 24 hours without the aid of electricity, etc., etc. So there's a lot of kind of ideas there where people might be given, again, time limited or geographically limited rights to occupy, so that we can continue to enjoy the coast until those greater aspects of climate change occur, if you like. So I think it's about getting some different thinking about the concepts of property rights, which of course are the basis of our financial system. They're very entrenched in our social systems. Coastal protection works are really interesting and have their own set of issues, and I would love to spend a bit of time on them, but we'll just have to race through them. And I was really picking up on some of the points that were raised in the Wye River example earlier in the presentations. And so there are, some issues about who's responsible for what, in what areas, what rights and powers that different authorities have. And some of that will depend on where the works need to take place. Is it in the Crown land? Is it in a coastal reserve, a council-owned land, for example? Do the hard protection works need to be on the private property itself? And so there'll be different responsibilities, different abilities to undertake those works. And for example, in the coastal marine area, you need a permit to undertake coastal works. Alongside that is who pays, and then particularly the issue around who maintains those structures. And that's often a reason for authorities not wanting to put in hard structures because they don't have the ability or the funds to maintain them. And there's also issues around liability because, as we mentioned, fixing a problem here might create a problem down there. Who's liable for that problem down there? If the council or the coastal management authority, the relevant body creates works up here or installs infrastructure up here that has impacts down the coast, are they liable for those? So there's quite a lot of issues there. And also, just to finish on this, there is some really interesting case law about what are the rights of a private property owner to build structures to protect their own land and how that intersects with the planning scheme and so forth, which you could delve into as well. However, I wanted to spend a little bit of time speaking about climate change litigation. I know I've only got a short amount of time, but just really to touch on some of what's coming through, some of the cases that you might be hearing about or reading about in the media. And just really to note that actually Australia has the second highest record of climate change litigation after the US. So we're right up there in this area. And I'm only going to look really briefly at the first two categories there. So as I said, early litigation was really about, in Victoria at least, was really about what rights and powers and responsibilities do council have. But really, we've got a lot of climate change and coastal climate change provisions in our planning schemes, and councils have a reasonable degree of discretion, which can lead to inconsistencies and therefore potential legal challenges. And there are entrenched rights in the Planning and Environment Act. If you're a submitter, you have the right to challenge a decision at VCAT. And that's happening every day. And some of them will be coastal climate change issues. Perhaps a little bit more where some of the law is really being made and adapting existing law to the new situation is in challenges to particularly coal mines. This is the Gloucester Resources case, and this purple text down the bottom in a legal situation, this is one of the first times we've seen a general reference to climate change and the need to reduce emissions being given as one of the reasons for turning down the approval for this coal mine. So that's really significant. I'm going to skip over that one, but litigants are getting really creative and relying on different types of cases. So in 2015, we had the Dutch case where the court in that situation said that the Dutch government had a duty under the European Convention on Human Rights to prevent dangerous climate change in relation to its population, and actually ordered it to take action to reduce its greenhouse gases. We haven't had anything so momentous, I guess, in Australia, but this year, a group of school children were successful in challenging the federal minister in relation to the Vickery expansion project, again, another coal mine, and successfully argued that the federal minister had a duty of care to all persons under the age of 18 years in Australia to take reasonable care to avoid causing them harm from further carbon emissions when determining whether or not to approve the project. There's another case going on, youth verdict, relying on Queensland Human Rights Act and some of the human rights provisions there. And that's, if successful, that would create a real precedent. And we're watching that one because in Victoria, we have very similar human rights legislation. So again, sort of different ways of getting challenging projects. And this one here is really interesting. Again, this is this year. And this was a successful action in the New South Wales Land and Environment Court, where the New South Wales EPA was challenged for failing to develop environmental quality objectives, etc., in relation to climate change. And the court held that they had failed in that duty and made an order compelling the EPA to better perform its statutory duty and implement more detailed climate change measures. So that's an example of how to get the regulator to act. Another one, and this is my last one, again, very interesting. Oh, sorry, that was it. How might these cases apply to coastal climate change and erosion? So what we're seeing is that as the impacts of climate change begin to be felt more and more and in different ways, as those physical impacts happen, you've got new potential litigants. So you're sort of seeing an increase in the number of people who potentially would have a cause of action. We've got some real change and new thinking about how might those that litigation be framed, and a growing acceptance by the courts that climate change is human induced, and but still some issues about causation. So just in summary, I'd say that the law is adapting and being reinterpreted in response to climate change issues. We've now got quite a lot of good coastal climate change policy and planning schemes, but there are some limitations and we need to get creative. Thank you.
Unmute. There we go.
Yeah.
Sorry, it was all lost. Anyway, that was fabulous. Thank you so much. So we've heard from these three amazing experts, extremely interesting, taking the information that we received in the other two webinars about the physical and the science of how complicated climate change and its impact on the coast is, and looking at what we can do about it and how we can do something about it, and not looking at just planning and regulation, but looking at the human side of that, the social side of that, and the community side of that. And in each case, showing that the leverage that can be used, if you like, to mitigate or avoid or manage the physical impacts of climate change on our coast, it can be leveraged by the social, by the human, by looking at those communities and what they can do and what they want. Not only introduces equity or can try to introduce a degree of equity in what climate change is going to do along the coast, but also in the planning and in the way in which those communities make change. May also leverage too. I know that there'll be a lot of questions, but there's an interesting early question from Peter McPhee, who is asking whether this emphasis on communities having a say, communities making decisions, collaboration and so on, how that runs alongside what the science is clearly saying. It's obviously the link there, I imagine, would be communication, but I'd like to throw that to probably Sonia and Lauren at this point, if you'd like to talk about that question. Can we hear you?
Yep, there we go. Yeah, thank you for that question. So I guess from my point of view, when we have asked communities about their views on climate change and the impacts, we found that a lot of people can already report and identify impacts that they've been observing. And there's a lot of, I guess it depends on the community you're in as to how much their agreement there is. But I guess it's about starting that conversation. And I know that there are a lot of local councils who find it difficult to have that conversation because of the potential for conflict, because of the potential for diverse views. But if we don't start that conversation, then how do we plan for the future and bring people along?
Meredith, or actually Lauren, since it's actually starting with you, the question was really about how do you balance your call for participatory decision making with what we've been told about listening to scientists. What would you say, Lauren?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, it's about understanding the value of all the different types of expertise, including local expertise. And so while the science is essential to understanding climate change and what we need to do, so too is that more local experience that helps us to understand what impacts look like, what adaptation needs to address. And no amount of academic research will be able to replicate that. So while adaptation definitely is enhanced by social research, and requires the sort of science and expertise that you've heard in these webinars. At the same time, it's over to everyone, you know, in the audience here to also work out what's needed and how it can be done. This is a big planetary experiment. There's no rule book, and so we need to work through together.
And would you like to comment on that, Meredith?
I think the only comment I'd make is that the legislation is set up so that both types of information is taken into account, and it is, having sat on decision-making bodies, it can be really difficult to balance that up. But I think it's really going to what both Sonia and Lauren have talked about, is that the community values or the community input is more about what are the values and how do we use these places and what do we want for them, and the science is assisting with more of the technical side, so that they need to be kept separate, but they're both really important in that decision making, because if you're just looking at technical information, that might suggest you go in a direction that the community doesn't want or doesn't value, and that's not very good decision making either.
And back to Sonia.
Sorry, can I just add on that? Because I've also seen where communities have challenged the science because of their own experiences. And so I think it's really important that the science isn't done in isolation of the communities too, because they also have knowledge and expertise to bring.
Yeah, and just one final point, which is that, you know, a lot of what we need to do has to be informed by monitoring and data, which is slightly separate to the question of science. And that requires a whole lot of citizen science. It requires a whole lot of people on deck taking very careful note of what's going on. And again, it's something that unfortunately our rather desiccated research system in Australia is certainly not set up to be able to do. So we need everyone helping.
Mm. Can I move on to a general theme that's come through these first three webinars, which is that there seems to be a huge frustration, though, with actually putting this into process, because societies, communities, citizen scientists, observers, locals are trying really hard to get a coordinated approach whereby something can be done. And although it was fascinating to hear about the law from Meredith, I think for many of us on the ground who've tried to do anything at the community level, it's a very blunt and difficult instrument and takes a lot of time. And what has been discussed quite a lot has been, how do we actually coordinate all these different levels of regulation going forward and get them to do something that makes us have a better and quicker response? We've had lots of ideas here, but physically, how do us people on the ground make this work? Can I throw that to the three of you? We'll start with Sonia. How do we actually implement the things that you three have been talking about? And we talked about the other two webinars too, in terms of adapting and getting things moving so that we're not always behind. The step diagrams and all those are great, but I think we often feel like there's really nowhere to go. We've got the council who are going to block things if there's developers in their ear, and you know, it's just not coordinated. There's no one who's really just letting us know what to do. I'm talking for the every person here at the community level. Sonia, what would you suggest?
Yeah, look, I agree. I think it's really challenging, and some of our research looks at collective action and how you get that happening. And so the research I've done on collective action in the adaptation space, there's a lot of communities who just are starting to get out and do things, and almost because government isn't, the communities are stepping up and into that space and starting to take ownership. So whether that is going on and doing some, you know, management of dunes and trying to, you know, protect the homes that way, whether it's actually engaging consultants themselves and crowdsourcing money to get the consultants' reports to provide the evidence that they need. So I think it doesn't require waiting for government, and I think there are plenty of actions that communities can already start to do to push and to lobby.
Yeah, Lauren?
And I guess, you know, complementing that too, like there's actually a huge amount of action around adaptation in Victoria, certainly, you know, relative to other places. And with that comes opportunities. And you can be cynical about formal consultation processes, of course. Certainly we're usually cynical about the ones closest to us. But at the same time, they are, openings, they're cracks that we can, help to leverage open. And so, the Victorian government has just is in the process of completing, a massive adaptation planning process that's considered both a whole range of different regions, including the one we're talking about, plus also systemic adaptation. And having that systemic view, I think, is really important because it speaks to this need to look at things at different scales. So one of the risks of very, very place-based adaptation is that it can blind you to the ways in which a lot of what influences your lives is actually determined not just by holes of government, but also by long, supply chains, by long distant effects. And COVID-19 has been a really sharp lesson in that. So, adapting our systems, so our built environment systems, our education systems, our water systems, given that we're all reliant on those infrastructures and services, is really important. And so to come to your question, each of those has had a consultation process. So it's one example of the ways in which we can get involved, start talking, and really learn what the possibilities are.
Thank you. Do you want to respond to that, Meredith? Because I have a question for you as well.
Oh, okay. I was just going to quickly say that I wanted to pick up on Sonia's point about communities perhaps, maybe going for grants or for crowdsourcing, because I think one of the issues is that, say, if you've got a council who's dealing with a situation where they've got to choose between a developer and a community view, is often the developer's much better resource. They've got the great consultant and that kind of thing. And I think the community groups, if they want to move things forward, is that it may not be fair, but the reality is you have to get your own consultants. You have to have that evidence in front of the decision maker, because the decision maker has to deal with the evidence before them. And that's perhaps a bit of a legal view, but I think it's about, we talk about getting involved, and I think that maybe people think to some extent, well, the government should do it, but I think we've just got to get over that. We've got to do it, and it will cost us, but it'll cost us more not to do it.
Okay, thank you. That's what we've learned. There's a question here for you, Meredith, from Michelle Fillmore. How seriously does the government and various departments and planners and panels take the precautionary principle in terms of sustainability of future public developments in the high-risk coastal hazard zones?
I actually might decline to answer that because I do sit on some panels and I'm not able to talk about internal decision making. But I guess I would say that definitely, the case law is clear and that it is required to be taken into account. But I apologise for not being able to answer that question.
No, thank you. That was great. Thank you. There's a question here for Lauren and Sonia, a larger question perhaps. Precaution assumes a common sense of risk. Some people and communities are highly sensitive to risk and others are prepared to tolerate more. So how do agencies deal with that range of risk appetite, and how do we regulate that? Sonia, would you like to go first on that one?
I might throw that to Lauren first.
Lauren.
Well, simply to say that, everyone here obviously is very attuned to some of the complexities, and unfortunately there's no magic formula, but simply that, risks are subjective because we do have that consequences side of it, which brings in values and questions about what we really want to protect and sustain. And everyone is in a different position. We just need, again, to, draw lessons from the COVID-19 experience about, forgetting about all the flow-on effects of lockdown, etc. I mean, even just the virus itself means very different things according to where people are placed biologically, medically, etc. So it is an inescapable complexity. And really, I suppose the thing is to draw on the wealth of tools that are available. There's a lot of techniques around to actually try to structure the conversation, to go through a process so that even if the outcome may still be imperfect from the perspectives of many of those involved, you've achieved, what they call procedural justice. You've gone through a process in good faith that has tried to hear the different perspectives, that has tried in this very difficult situation to come up with something that is reasonable and tolerable by others. And I think that's the best we can do. There is no single, perfect, everybody excited answer.
Do you want to leave it at that, Sonia, or would you like to add?
I was just going to say that I think a lot of the councils that I've seen really are, in a sense, trying to deal with that precautionary principle. Like, they're dealing with the predictions and they're trying to come up with a plan and be cautious about it, but bring people with them. So I think there is a genuine commitment to that, but obviously the actual challenge of trying to implement that and also pass it through the various levels of government isn't always straightforward.
Yeah. One of our speakers from Monday, Juliette Lefebvre, has asked, how do we as coastal communities go about doing the kind of community values work that Sonia described to inform adaptation planning? Who could help us and perhaps help us with the funding as well? We've sort of talked about that a little, but can I throw that to you all? Lauren, I can see that you're nodding. That might be unwise, now you have to answer it, but...
Well, I'll listen to Sonia first.
Okay.
Yeah, look, in terms of who's able to do it, look, I think like we developed a manual and we've seen that other consultants can run with it. So if you can fund a consultant, that's great. I know that's not always possible. Most of the work that I've done that I talked about today was actually done by students. So I've had honours students, master's students, PhD students all do this work. And so there's, I've even got a student who signed up for doing something similar next year. So I think that's another way in which this work can be done.
Mm.
Any additions?
Well, and also just to say that part of what we need to do is start equipping ourselves. This is a big kind of educational challenge. And as I've sort of indicated, yes, there's areas of expertise. Yes, we do need to draw on that. And there's certainly a burgeoning consulting industry around this as well. But, I'm sure Sonia would agree that there's aspects of it, aspects that, groups could do themselves as well in a self-led way, because the danger is that those who do have the resources, really kind of gallop ahead on this. And, that would in and of itself be maladaptive. So we need to really think carefully. And there's all sorts of interesting things more in the mitigation space that we could learn and bring across to the adaptation space. A whole lot of community peer-to-peer learning, discussion groups, all sorts of networks and alliances. That's not yet really evident so much in the adaptation space. It is to some degree at some levels, particularly among local councils, I know, but we could do a lot more. I'm
really sorry that we're going to... Meredith, did you want to add to that? Because we're just running out of time, unfortunately.
No, really just to support Lauren's comments.
Yeah, thank you. Look, it was just, you're all three of you just so interesting and illuminating, and it was extremely interesting conversation, so I'm glad it's recorded. We now have to close because the time is right on really 4:15. I just want to tell you all who are here that the fourth webinar in this series will take place on November the 8th. That's the week after the Cup weekend, and it'll start at 3 o'clock at the same time. And there we'll take it to the Crunch people, the representatives from the, as in terms of the people who are going to be other than us going to be doing things, representatives from the range of local and state government agencies which have responsibility for coastal management and with dealing with the issues that we've encountered so far. So that webinar will also allow them to respond to the questions about the challenges of adaptation that have arisen this week. So that will be hopefully a very interesting session that will help activate even further change. Thank you very much. Looking forward to seeing you all there. And thank you again today for everyone involved today, technically, the management behind the scenes, and to our three wonderful speakers. Thank you very much.